wanted to trade the little girl for some flour. Samuel Dennis told them he would give them the flour, but for them to keep their papoose. They said, "No, she will die anyway if we keep her." So they went away and left her. Samuel and Mary Hannah raised the little girl, whom they called Ellen, to womanhood, treating her as if she were their own. In the spring of 1859, Samuel Dennis was called to move to Beaver, 60 miles north of Cedar City, where in 1861 their ninth child, Teresa Isabel, was born. Lucy Flake, their eldest daughter, wrote in her diary that when the Saints crossed the plains,
"We were happy because we all had hopes and plans and were with our friends. But here in Utah, we would just get a home started when we would be called to move on to settle a new place, leaving our friends and family. That's when being a pioneer really seemed a hardship."
Philo Farnsworth had moved his family to Beaver City in December of 1856. There he served as bishop of the ward for some 8 years. As a leader, he took other wives. Margaret Adams in 1857 was from Scotland, as was Agnes Ann Patterson, whom he married in 1858. The second Margaret had a daughter, Mary Elizabeth, who married Aaron Robert Edwards. They had a son, Philo Taylor Edwards, and a grandson named Lavelle. Agnes Ann became the mother of Louis Edwin Farnsworth, and in time, the grandmother of another Philo Taylor Farnsworth, well known for his skill in electronics. The fourth wife, Mary Priscilla Griffiths, was from England. Franklin Dewey Farnsworth and his future wife, Melissa Burton White, grew up together in Beaver, attending the same school. When Frank was about 8 years old, he was baptized by Melissa's father, Samuel Dennis White. Frank was a very good speller and was active in all the school sports and rather a tease with the girls. Frank's father finally had the farm he had wanted for so long. As they became established, he was able to spend more time at home telling the children his experiences or reading to them from his few choice books. Some of his associates felt that Bishop Farnsworth was too kind to his children. One of them related the following story. Young Philo Jr. at age 17 ran away from home with 2 of his boyfriends. Bishop Kimball of Kanosh, 40 miles away, telegraphed Philo that the boys were at his home. Accompanied by William and Joseph Flake, Philo went after the boys. It snowed during the night, and when they arrived in Kanosh, Bishop Kimball showed them 3 mounds of snow out by the straw stack, the 3 boys. The young Flake boy said later that this was one time when he expected to see Bishop Farnsworth really trounce his son. To his surprise, Philo took the corners of the quilt, shook the snow away carefully, and said, "Philo, don't you think it's time we were journeying home?" The boys got up and went back to Beaver without a word.
Melissa's father farmed too, but Samuel Dennis White owned his own oxen and some horses and wagons and did freighting in the winter time, an important source of income for the White family. Until the railroad reached Utah, all supplies that couldn't be produced at home had to be hauled in by team and wagon. He went to California for paper for the Deseret News, and on some of his trips east, he brought back factory-made cloth and spools of thread to the delight of the womenfolk. In 1863, he was made one of the captains over a group who hauled produce from the valley to sell and brought back immigrants. They took with them 4,300 pounds of Utah-grown cotton to sell, the first ship from Utah. Mary Hannah tended to be a worrier, but her husband always reassured her, "Don't worry, Mother. We will be all right. The Lord will take care of us and protect us." And he always did. Samuel Dennis White also took additional wives. On December 6, 1860, he married Isabel Reed in Beaver. He was married briefly to a young Scottish girl, Ellen Duncan, in 1863, but Mary Hannah objected to Samuel paying Ellen's transportation from Scotland, so Ellen left him and married another man. His 5th wife was Lydia Harris, a widow who had 4 children.
Harriet Shepherd, who later married Frank's brother William Farnsworth, spent a happy summer with Melissa's family. After Hattie had returned home, she came back one night, sat under Melissa's window, played her guitar, and sang the Spanish Cavalier. Immediately the window flew up. Out crawled Melissa in her nightgown with high neck and long sleeves. How they laughed.
During Melissa's later childhood, the Whites had a 5-room brick house. This house had one of the first sinks in the area. The wooden basin was lined with a sheet of zinc and had an outlet into a bed of gravel outside to prevent mud from forming where the sink emptied. Samuel White's last trip east was made with a mule team, bringing 23 immigrants from Fort Laramie, Wyoming to Salt Lake City, arriving there September 5, 1866. In late September 1868, he and several friends went to Salt Lake City for General Conference. On the return trip, Samuel became too ill to travel. The men took him back to the home of his daughter, Mary Elizabeth Musser, in Salt Lake, where he died of pneumonia on October 17th. He is buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery.
By the time Franklin Dewey Farnsworth was married, he had 15 living brothers and 7 living sisters. His second mother, Margaret Adams Farnsworth, had died in 1872, leaving 6 young children. On September 11, 1876, when he was 22 years old, he was ordained an elder and married Melissa Burton White. Melissa had blue eyes and long brown hair that fell in waves to her waist. How she used to love to comb it and bob it on top of her head, but she could not wear it that way as it made her head ache, so she wore it in a bob on her neck. The year after Frank and Melissa were married, the beaver stake was organized, and Philo Farnsworth was called to be a member of the High Council. He also served as probate judge of Beaver County and was a member of the territorial legislature and served 4 terms as mayor of Beaver. Melissa's first 2 children were born in Beaver City, Alice in Grandmother White's home and Ida in the home of Grandmother Farnsworth. During the early summer of 1881, Frank was hired as a school teacher at Joseph City, Sevier County, Utah. That September, Margaret Lucinda Retta was born. A year later, Margaret Yates Farnsworth developed pneumonia and died. She was 58. A 4th daughter, Dewey, was born to Frank and Melissa in 1884. During the summertime, Frank raised crops on a farm near Joseph at what was called Jericho. They shared a duplex house with the Jim Levitt family. Melissa and Frank both enjoyed taking part in plays. They would put the children to bed in the wagon in front of the building where the play was being held and where they could see them from the stage. One of the girls remembers how frightened the children were when they saw their mother seem to drink from a cup of poison in the play 10 Nights in a Barroom and fall to the floor, but how happy they were when she came out to see them a little later. Frank also had a lighter side. His daughter Dewey told about his coming home from one of his long trips sooner than expected, so he decided to play a joke on the family. He rapped loudly on the locked door, and when Melissa demanded who was there, he pretended to be an officer seeking someone hiding in the house. A woman on the underground was staying with the Farnsworths at this time. The excitement inside made Frank laugh, and Melissa recognized his voice. Her relief and joy at his return was expressed in laughter and tears, and then a good warm supper. In 1886, Amelia was born. 5 little girls. Most of the time, they wore brown denim dresses that wouldn't tear or show the dirt. They had little boots with brass tips on the toes for sturdier wear. Philo's health was failing, but he was a patient sufferer. He was confined to his bed only a week before his death on Melissa's birthday, July 31st, 1887, at age 61. The local paper called him a great and good man, a man who has stood firm in his integrity to the principles of the gospel of Christ. Frank and Melissa were beginning to think there were no boys assigned to their home. But on the 9th of December, 1887, a boy at last. They named him Franklin Dennis after his father and grandfather. That same winter, someone brought whooping cough to their home, and the tiny baby and 4 of the girls had it. The following spring, Frank and his family moved again. Ida told of her father coming in from the field and saying, "Melissa, we must move from here. I have a strange presentiment of disaster." The place was sold, and with all their possessions packed in 2 wagons, they set out for Beaver. That summer, word reached them of a terrible epidemic of diphtheria in Jericho. The family who had bought their house lost all 5 of their children with the disease. Melissa and Frank offered up a prayer of thanks to Heavenly Father for his timely warning, while shedding tears for the poor heartbroken parents whose children were not so fortunate. In Beaver, Frank managed 3 farms owned by his older brother Philo, who also owned the house where they lived. Melissa excelled in making butter, which she sold at Sulphurdale, a nearby mining town. On March 6, 1890, Burton Kent was born in Grandfather Farnsworth's home in Beaver. That winter, all the children had mumps, and the next winter, they all had the measles. Melissa longed to have her own home. On Sunday, July 31st, 1892, they went to town for Sunday school and were having dinner at the home of Frank's sister, Lydia Caroline, whom they called Aunt Caddy. Frank came in and laid a paper in Melissa's lap and said, "Here is your birthday present." It was the deed to a big, unfinished pink rock house on 1st North and 2nd West in Beaver, a block from Aunt Caddy's. Melissa was so pleased she cried, and the whole family went over to inspect the house. That September they moved into the new home. It was still unfinished, but livable. Frank said they would never have to move to the farm again. Melissa was expecting again that winter, so Frank clerked in the local dry goods store to be more available. In late February, walking over to her Aunt Caddy's house, Melissa slipped and fell on the icy walk. She was confined to her bed for a week. The children were relieved and happy to get home from school on the afternoon of Friday, the 3rd of March, to find her sitting in her favorite rocking chair, laughing and talking to Aunt Hattie, the sister-in-law who had been her friend as a young girl. She said she was waiting for her girls to get home to comb and braid her hair, which they dearly loved to do. Little did they dream it was the last time they would do this. Before morning, her 3rd son was born, but Melissa had given up her life. Her last words were concerning who would take care of Frank and her children. They named the baby Philo Yates after Frank's parents. Elizabeth Munson Farnsworth, the wife of Frank's half-brother Edward, who had recently lost the baby, offered to breastfeed Philo. Frank gave the child to her, thinking it would be for a short time only. Elizabeth became so attached to the baby that when he remarried, Frank allowed her to keep Philo, much against his own wishes. A year after Melissa's death, Frank married her niece, Mary Ann White, the eldest of 9 children of Samuel Orson White and Mary Ellen Woodhouse. From earliest childhood, Mary Ann had been her mother's chief helper. When she was 7 years old, she sometimes had to help with milking, planting, and harvesting on her father's farm down near Greenville. When Mary was 9 years old, she got a little brother, but when Harvey was a year old, he had what was called spinal meningitis, and her mother scarcely had him out of her arms for 3 months. During that whole winter, Mary's father was confined to his bed with inflammatory rheumatism, probably arthritis, so that the main responsibility of the household devolved on Mary, then 11 years old, plus what help the neighbors gave. Mary was very much in demand as a hired girl for the extended family, if she could possibly be spared at home, perhaps because she was hired for nothing, and because she was so trustworthy. She was an excellent student and finished the 5th reader, which was as high as a student could go in those days. As her mother's health failed, Mary saw that the farm workers were fed and cared for. She also cared for both her grandmothers as they grew older. Then she took care of her own invalid mother for 2 years before her death on September 6, 1892. One bright spot in Mary's life the following spring was going with her father to the dedication of the Salt Lake Temple. The dedication came just a month after Melissa Farnsworth's death. All the aunts tried to help with Franklin's family, and Frank frequently came to the Samuel Orson White house for dinner. It probably surprised no one when on June 6, 1894, Mary and Frank were married. Frank's oldest daughter, Alice, and her friend Bessie Beckley were the chaperones on the trip to the temple, which took 3 days. In Salt Lake City, they stayed at the home of Frank's brother Philo. While in Salt Lake City, Frank and Mary bought new furniture for the parlor, as well as a sewing machine from ZCMI. Burton told how he and his brother Dennis watched for their parents to return, and the joy they felt when the carriage arrived with a new mother, whom the children called Aunt Mary. Mary never forgot her own family and often helped when there was illness or death. In time, she had 6 children of her own. Samuel Taylor, 29th of October, 1896. Mary Ellen, 7th